Hello, my name is Laura Perry, and I currently serve as a women's minister at First Stone Ministries. Interestingly, I lived as a transgender individual for almost 9 years. I never imagined that one day I would be working in women's ministry. In fact, I carried a lot of anger and resentment toward women. To give some context to my story, I grew up in a family that went to church regularly. We were there every time the doors were open. We were seen as the perfect American family. In fact, some people even told us they thought our family didn't have any problems. We maintained an impeccable image. However, part of my story is deeply intertwined with my mom's because God used both of our stories to shape us. My mom grew up in a very legalistic church, which prevented her from understanding the peace and grace of the Holy Spirit. She didn't know how to live in God's presence or how to let the Lord work in her life. As a result, she was often overwhelmed and stressed. She would frequently ask me to leave her alone or give her some space. As a child, it was hard for me to understand that. I was a very hyperactive kid. My mom used to say I probably would have been diagnosed with ADHD, but she didn't want to medicate me. Because of that, I started interpreting her exhaustion as a lack of love. I couldn't understand how stressed she was or how hard she was trying to manage the responsibilities of adulthood. On top of that, I was the youngest child, born many years after my 2 older brothers. My mom also had significant health issues, like severe fibromyalgia, which made even the touch of bedsheets at night unbearable for her. Because of this, she avoided physical contact, but my love language was physical touch. My dad was more affectionate toward me, but my mom, due to her limitations, couldn't show love in the same way. I also noticed how she interacted with my brother, who was more easygoing and obedient. He seemed to get different treatment. My mom never said this to me, but I started to believe that she loved him more, or that she wished I had been one of the 2 boys she lost to miscarriages before me. These thoughts stirred up a lot of jealousy in me toward my brother. I mention this because I've heard many stories of children who misunderstand family dynamics. Sometimes we believe things about our parents that just aren't true. None of us are perfect parents. We're sinners raising other sinners. The truth is that children sometimes feel unloved, even when they are loved. It might be that the parents aren't able to show love in the way the child needs. But none of us are fully capable of meeting all of our children's needs. That's why we need to point our children to God, who is the only one sufficient to meet all their needs. My story is a combination of being deeply hurt and responding to that hurt in the wrong ways. I started to become very bitter, very angry with my mom. Between the ages of 5 and 8, at such a young age, I went through a cycle of desperately trying to get her attention to feeling bitter about not receiving the attention I thought I needed. That bitterness grew over the years. But I think part of it was because I thought that if my mom noticed how hurt I was, she would pay more attention to me and I could get her attention. To get her to notice, I did anything I could think of, and when that didn't work, I started building walls around my heart and pushing her away. She didn't deserve any of that. I didn't realize how much stress she was under or how hard she was trying to do everything she thought she needed to do. She used to tell me that she felt like she was on a performance treadmill for God. And even now, I hear this from many Christian women who are struggling and going through similar things. I don't want anyone listening to this to think they are completely failing as a parent. We are all sinners. We desperately need the Lord. That's why it's so important to understand our relationship with God, to understand that He is the one who gives us strength. He doesn't expect us to go out and perform perfectly for Him. He wants us to fully depend on Him. As a result of building this wall and shutting her out, I started to feel very angry with her. I began clinging to my dad. In fact, people used to tell me that I was just like my dad, that I acted like him, that I had the same personality as him, and I really started to identify with him. We also see this pattern in people who were molested as children and later identify as transgender. But it was complicated. When I was 8 years old, and I was molested by another boy, and in some ways it was only recently that I realized how much I had cut off that part of myself in an attempt to protect that girl. I think I dissociated a little bit. I started telling myself stories about being a boy. I felt like boys had the power, and I was helpless. That boy was my friend's brother. I was 8 years old, and he was just 1 year older than me. The hardest part was that it took me many years to talk about it. In fact, I didn't even tell my parents until I was 33. And the first time I told my mom, she didn't even seem to understand what I was saying. I think it was just so painful for her. It was like she couldn't fully comprehend it. So she assumed I hadn't told her all those years.
Oh, he was only a year older than me, and because it was a kind of sexual game, it awakened this desire. And even at 8 years old, it was fun, it felt good, and at the same time it was very violating and very wrong. I felt so ashamed, and I knew it wasn't good. But at the same time, your body reacts to it and it feels good, and so I went back to him later and said it was so much fun, I wanted to do it again.
I didn't fully understand the depth of it all, but part of me knew that something about it was wrong because I felt ashamed and didn't tell my parents or talk about it with anyone. The Bible says that God has written His law on our hearts, and I think that even though I didn't know why it was wrong, I just knew it was. But I didn't know anything about sex. I had been so sheltered and protected until that day, and it stole my innocence. But when I went back to him, he said we could never do that again and completely rejected me. He told me he didn't want anything to do with me and added that this is how girls get pregnant, and I should have known that. He was also very young, and it's pretty obvious that someone had likely molested him as well. I haven't spoken to him since. I remember even at 8 years old thinking that boys had all the power. I was just good for the taking. I felt so thrown away and discarded, you know. I remember feeling dirty, and how could an 8-year-old not feel capable of going to her own mother and talking to her mother? I started hiding from all these secret desires, and over the years, I started getting involved in inappropriate games with other children. I started living a double life, growing more and more angry with my mom and with God. I didn't like being a girl. I felt jealous of my brother, and that jealousy grew even stronger toward boys in general because it seemed like they had all the power. I felt like, as a girl, I had no value. I spent all my time with my dad and my brother, and that made it hard for me to fit in with the girls at school. At school, the girls would tease me and make me feel out of place. They often called me a tomboy. Some girls don't mind that label, but for me, it was different. Even though I wanted to be a boy, deep down, I knew I wasn't. That created a part of me that desperately wanted to fit in. I knew I was supposed to be like the other girls, but I didn't know how. Sometimes I tried to fake it, but it felt like that just wasn't me. I oscillated between trying to look more feminine and embracing my tomboy side. There were times when I made a big effort to seem more like a girl, but then I would go through phases where I dressed and acted much more masculine. It was a constant struggle to try and fit in. Back then, I had never heard the word transgender. That concept didn't exist in the culture. I only knew that I wished I were a boy and felt like one, but I didn't have the language to describe it. I played with my brother's toys, wore his clothes, and spent a lot of time with my dad. Both of us were very passionate about car racing. My dad used to take me to watch races, and we also played a lot of sports together. My brother and I would play soccer. Over the years, I started creating stories where I was a boy. I invented a male character, and every night before falling asleep, I would imagine stories about that character. He became a kind of alter ego. I started playing a lot of video games, always choosing male characters. This consumed much of my free time when I wasn't playing sports. When I was 14, I was diagnosed with polycystic ovary syndrome. I had cysts all over my ovaries and lived in constant, excruciating pain. I remember falling out of my chair and writhing on the floor because of how intense the pain was. I went to the doctor, who confirmed the diagnosis, but the medication he suggested had serious side effects. He told me I would gain a lot of weight, which I was already struggling with since puberty. On top of that, the doctor insensitively said, "You'll have trouble getting pregnant." He said this to a 14-year-old girl. Despite all the envy I felt toward boys, there was a part of me that wanted to have children one day. I wasn't thinking about it at the time, but still, hearing that was devastating. I became furious with God. People told me that God had created me this way on purpose, that He doesn't make mistakes. But to me, it felt like God had given me a body I didn't want, a body that only caused me pain. And not only that, but this body didn't even work properly, and now I couldn't have children either. I thought, if God made me a girl and gave me a mom who seems like she doesn't want a girl? In my mind, my mom wished I had been a boy. I didn't understand the pain of her miscarriages or the differences in personality between us. To me, it all felt like confirmation that there was something wrong with me. I reached a point where I thought, God is cruel. I decided He wasn't trustworthy. It's interesting because some things the Lord has shown me in Scripture have really shaped my journey. In Hebrews 12, it says that bitterness leads to corruption and often to sexual sin because it contaminates many people. We've all heard the phrase, hurt people, and that's exactly what happened to me. I began acting out in much more reckless ways, especially sexually. Another key lesson the Lord taught me is found in Romans, where it says that God's kindness leads to repentance. Interestingly, the opposite is also true. A few years ago, when I was sick one weekend, I decided to dedicate that time to the Lord and watch hundreds of testimonies online. I didn't watch TV, just testimonies, and I learned so much about how God works. One thing I noticed in almost every case was the presence of one question that turned people's hearts away from God. If God is good, why did He allow this to happen in my life? I deeply resonated with that question because it was exactly what I had been thinking. Romans also talks about how God has revealed Himself to all people, but many did not glorify Him as God or give thanks. Instead, they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. It says they claimed to be wise, but became fools and exchanged the truth of God for a lie. I see this pattern so often. We can blame different circumstances, but I've realized how lies began to take root in my heart, and in response to them, I sinned. I was angry with God and my mom. I built walls, rejected my feminine identity, and decided I knew better than God. This led me into a cycle of sexual sin. I began giving myself completely to men, desperate for male love and attention. Growing up, I felt my dad loved me very much, in a totally appropriate way, and I craved the love of a man. I thought that to get it, I needed to do whatever they wanted. So I did whatever they asked of me sexually, but the more I did, the more broken, hurt, discarded, and rejected I felt, over and over again. Eventually, my parents found out. Over time, they started noticing my rebellion. Even though I tried to hide some things, I later realized they knew more than I thought. I guess that's typical of parents. Sometimes they don't know how to address certain situations. They tried to help me, but I was so rebellious that there wasn't much they could do. I was completely out of control, and my soul was falling apart. I would always leave those relationships feeling broken, only to jump into the next one, desperate to feel loved. Eventually, my parents sent me to a temporary home. They were trying everything they could to help me. While I was there, I told the Lord I would never serve Him again. I was running, especially after being diagnosed with polycystic ovary syndrome, which was a turning point for me. This was around the time I was 16. I was deeply hurt and furious with God. My solution was to believe that God wasn't good. I couldn't see how my own sin and the sin of others had contributed to the situation. I placed all the blame on God. This drove me further into a sinful lifestyle. At the temporary home, there was a lot of pressure to act like a Christian. At one point, I decided I was tired of the rebellious, party lifestyle. I tried to live as a Christian for a few years, but I didn't truly know the Lord. Like my mom, I was trying to do it in my own strength, and it didn't last. I ended up diving deep into an addiction to inappropriate content, which eventually led me to casual encounters with men across the state, desperately trying to fill the emptiness, even if just for a moment. When I was around 17 and later during college, the addiction to inappropriate content and one-night stands took over. During that time, I was still entirely feminine. I hadn't yet heard the word transgender. This was the late 90s and early 2000s when I was in college. By 2003, I was trying so hard to fix this broken identity and was always hoping that a man would want me, that a man would love me. I never felt physical attraction to women, but I wanted a girlfriend because that would solidify my identity as a man. However, it seemed impossible since I had never even considered the idea of transitioning. It was a secret world I carried inside me. Meanwhile, I continued pursuing relationships with men until I eventually entered a long-term relationship. I was always hoping a man would truly want me, but that relationship was awful. He was a severe alcoholic, and it made me think. The reason this never works, the reason I'm never happy, is because I'm supposed to be the man. If I were the man, I'd know how to treat a woman. That was the point when I began seriously pursuing this lifestyle. I had never heard the word transgender, but I Googled something like girl becoming boy, just to see if anyone had ever thought about it. I was shocked to find thousands of results. That's when I discovered a support group and started chasing this idea. In the meantime, I started my social transition and adopted a new name. I chose Jake, a name I had secretly used since childhood, based on a character I had created myself. I chose that name because I wanted something that could never be mistaken for a feminine name. As people began calling me Jake and treating me as a man, I felt a temporary sense of relief. It seemed like all the pain of being a woman had diminished. I thought, this is what I've always wanted. This is who I really am. I began to notice physical changes. My face started to look more masculine, my voice became deeper, and I started growing facial hair. All of it felt real at first, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Even so, I kept telling myself that someday it would be real because I was seeing concrete changes. I thought, one day, the dysphoria will go away. In 2009, I had a double mastectomy, which was a major milestone in my transition. However, after the surgery, I realized something devastating. It still didn't make me a man. Despite all the changes, all the external and internal affirmations, I was still fully aware that it wasn't real. This led me to double down on reinforcing my male identity. Everything, from how I dressed to how I walked and talked, had to affirm that identity. Anything that didn't reinforce it made me feel like I was failing. Even so, one feeling persisted. It's still not real. I convinced myself that it was because I still had female hormones. I thought I needed more changes to finally end the dysphoria and feel complete. I kept thinking, when I get rid of all the female hormones, then it will be real. So I had a hysterectomy and removed my ovaries. But still, it wasn't real. I was shocked when I started researching genital reassignment surgeries and realized how artificial it all was. I came to see that it would never solve the problem. It was something entirely manufactured. On top of that, there were so many potential complications. Over the years, I've heard of a girl who had more than 30 corrective surgeries. I know another who is permanently in a wheelchair. Some deal with severe urinary problems, while others have experienced tissue necrosis, where the tissue dies. There are so many other complications. And on top of all that, many lose complete sexual sensation. I began attending a community group and started receiving social affirmation. At the first support group meeting I attended, Everyone there was transgender. Within 5 minutes, they said, "Oh, you're definitely trans." They immediately started calling me Jake and affirming me as a man, even though they didn't know me.
Whoa.
That was my first time there. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I cut my hair really short and went to the meeting wearing a tight sweatshirt, trying to look as much like a man as possible. I didn't have a chest binder yet. When they told me I was definitely trans and began treating me as such, it felt like everything I'd ever wanted to hear. They assured me, after a year on hormones, no one will ever know you were a girl. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. I thought, this is the answer. This is everything I've been searching for. It all makes sense. Part of the process at the time required me to see a therapist to meet the standards of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which outlined the criteria for transitioning. I had no interest in therapy, but I needed the diagnostic letter to proceed with my transition. After 3 sessions, the therapist would provide a letter diagnosing me with gender identity disorder, which at the time was still classified as a mental disorder. However, something unexpected happened during the 3rd session. She put down her notebook and pen, adjusted her glasses, looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Wow, you have a lot of issues with your mom." I was stunned. I thought, wait, how did we go from talking about me being a man to talking about my mom? I wasn't even paying attention to the direction of the conversation. I just wanted to meet the requirement and get the letter to start hormones. When she mentioned my mom, I exploded. I said, "I'm not here to talk about my mom." She replied, "So, you're only here for the diagnosis?" And I said, "Yes, that's all I want." She then gave me what I wanted. In what other situation can a patient go to a doctor and say, "This is true about me," and the doctor simply accepts it, even if tests or observations say otherwise? We don't do this in any other scenario. For example, if someone wants chemotherapy but the oncologist says the person doesn't have cancer, they don't receive the treatment just because they want it. Yet, in this case, the patient determines what's best for them. Now there are people identifying as transabled. Some want to remove healthy limbs or intentionally become disabled. I'm not sure how widespread this is, but I know discussions about it exist. I've spoken to psychologists who mentioned how some girls in particular start mimicking symptoms they see on TikTok. They essentially adopt these symptoms, which creates new psychological and social challenges. There are cases where young people begin imitating symptoms they see in TikTok videos, like bipolar disorder, multiple personality disorder, or even pretending they can't walk. They internalize what they see and start repeating these behaviors. I've seen this happen, especially with men pretending they can't walk or claiming to be blind, using wheelchairs without any need. It's very strange. This raises the question, where does this stop? Are we going to allow people to identify however they want, without any limits? For example, there are children who identify as cats. At first, I thought the stories about schools installing litter boxes for these kids were fake. But according to some parents, this has actually happened in some schools. I don't know if it's something the students themselves demanded, or if there are more cases like this, but I've heard several stories of kids meowing in class to answer questions. And in some instances, though certainly not all, teachers have even accepted this behavior, treating them as if they really were cats. All of this ties into issues of identity, confusion, and a lack of belief in God, who created us and gave us a purpose. Oh. In the beginning, it felt like I was on top of the world. It was everything I had ever wanted. Testosterone gave me a sense of euphoria and a massive energy boost. For a woman who naturally has very low levels of testosterone, this change is significant. Women have testosterone in small amounts, but not at the same levels as men. That surge of energy was incredible for me. I had been dealing with health issues for years, including an autoimmune condition called Hashimoto's, which affects the thyroid and causes chronic fatigue. So when I started taking testosterone, I felt an amazing improvement. However, what I didn't realize was that this energy was purely the result of physical changes. In my mind, I thought, this is the solution to all my problems. I'm finally embracing who I really am. In reality, testosterone was helping me physically, but I didn't know it would bring so many negative consequences in the long run, since my body wasn't designed to handle such high levels of the hormone. Moreover, every little bit of social affirmation reinforced the male identity I was building. Studies conducted in the 1980s showed that when children who identified as transgender were not socially affirmed and received therapy, between 82% and 86% desisted from that identity after puberty. However, when these children are socially affirmed, whether through changes in name, clothing, or pronouns, each step seems to lead them further down that path. For those who start using puberty blockers, the numbers become even more concerning. In some studies, between 90% and 100% of these children go on to complete medical transition. This proves that puberty blockers are not a pause button, as many claim, but rather an accelerator toward medical transition. These small affirmations, whether social or physical, act like a form of emotional painkiller. They help mask the underlying pain. It's like taking painkillers for a severe infected wound. You feel relief in the moment, but the wound is still there, destroying the body from the inside. Some of these kids tell me, "But I feel so much better now." I've even heard therapists say, "Yes, I helped this child transition, and now they feel so much better. All their problems have disappeared." However, in reality, they're just ignoring the problem, burying it. Over time, though, the problem resurfaces. In my case, the initial euphoria with every step of the transition would eventually fade. For instance, when I legally changed my name, I was so excited. I couldn't wait to see my new name on my ID and documents. I was around 26 or 27 at the time, and my parents knew what was happening, but they had no control over it since I was already an adult. They felt completely powerless. When the day came and my name was officially changed, I experienced a momentary euphoria, but soon after came the question, now what? What's the next step? I was always chasing the next thing, like it was a drug. Each new milestone brought temporary joy, but it was never enough. Just like they say about hard drugs, the first high is always the best, and you keep chasing that feeling, but never find it again. As I progressed in my transition, instead of feeling free, I began to feel trapped. The further I went, the more I tried to erase the existence of Laura. I just wanted to be Jake. I wanted to erase my past completely. But I realized you can't escape your past. It haunted me. I constantly had to reinvent my story, lying to friends, bosses, and colleagues. For example, I couldn't say I had been a Girl Scout. I had to say I was a Boy Scout. I couldn't have played softball. I had to have played baseball. There were so many lies I had to create to sustain this new identity. There were also other challenges. For example, when I went to the gym, I wore a prosthetic genitalia and had to change in the men's locker room without being seen. Situations like that were full of problems and stress, things people don't think about when they imagine transitioning. Even when I was with my family, things weren't easy. Some family members affirmed me as Jake, but others didn't. My parents never called me Jake, but even if they had, it wouldn't have made a difference. Deep down, I knew I was still their sister or their aunt. I knew the truth. That internal conflict made me hate being around my family, and I started distancing myself from them. I didn't want anything to do with God. I thought I could fix my own pain, but over time, I realized that none of this was solving the problem. The dysphoria never went away. One day I realized that it would never be real. No matter what I did, it would never be true, and the dysphoria remained. In the end, all that was left was a deeply broken identity. I started living as trans in October 2007, but I didn't get access to hormones until months later. I was on hormone therapy for about a year and a half before deciding to have surgery. At first, testosterone made me feel great, but over time, that high started to wear off, and I thought, I need the next step, something that will finally make me look in the mirror and see Jake. So I decided to have a mastectomy. It was incredibly painful. It was an outpatient procedure, so I recovered at a hotel in San Francisco with a friend who wasn't even a nurse. I went to San Francisco because the surgeon was one of the most renowned in the world for female-to-male transgender procedures. I paid extra for that, but his results were excellent. Despite the physical pain, the emotional pain was much worse. I think the hardest part for me was realizing that the surgery didn't make it real, as I had believed it would. I knew I was planning more surgeries in the future, but I thought this one would be the key to erasing my dysphoria and legally becoming a man. When that didn't happen, it was devastating. Maybe a few weeks after the surgery, I realized this wasn't going to solve my problem. In fact, I don't know if I would have come to that conclusion so quickly if it hadn't been for a conversation with my boss at the time. She was a lesbian, very pro-LGBT, and was incredibly excited about my transition. About 6 weeks after the surgery, I went back to work, and she came up to me and said, "Look, I don't know what's going on with you, but you seem down, depressed, unmotivated. I want the Jake from before back." I was shocked. I thought, what does she mean by that? I'm happier than ever. I brushed off the comment and went home, but I couldn't stop thinking about what she had said. I reflected on it and realized I had been suppressing my depression. Whenever a thought came up about how this wasn't real, I buried it. But that night, I was forced to face the truth. She was right. I looked at pictures of myself like the ones on my driver's licenses and realized how depressed I had been at the time, even though I thought I was fine. It reminds me of what I see on social media today. Many trans people claim they feel happy, but looking at their posts, you can often see the sadness and emptiness in their eyes. They say they're fine, but they don't seem fine. Even happiness itself isn't a justification for all this. And yet, even that apparent happiness seems like a lie they tell themselves and others. I've seen videos of trans people, even prominent influencers, starting to question things more. Some are beginning to speak the truth about their experiences. Many of these people who are in the process of transitioning don't necessarily detransition because they don't see the point of going back. Some aren't Christians, so they don't have a bigger reason to change. However, many have started openly admitting that this isn't real, that it never solved the problem. Yet they still project a perfect social image. One reason for this persistence is that they believe they were born this way, and that there's nothing they can do about it. The goal is to encourage others to feel comfortable with this identity, even if they are suffering inside. I saw this clearly in one particular story. A girl who claimed to have an intersex condition made videos saying how happy she was with her transition, how great the surgeries were, and that she had no regrets. However, in a moment of honesty, she posted a video admitting the truth. She said she was having a horrible experience, full of complications, and had already undergone more than 30 corrective surgeries. At the end of the video, she said, "I wish I had never taken that first injection." This girl believed she had a genetic predisposition, but never disclosed what her condition was. Many transgender individuals claim they have intersex conditions because it provides a biological justification. I once told my dad this myself. He replied, "Okay, then let's get a genetic test." In that moment, I backed off and said, "No, I don't need that to know who I am." Deep down, I knew the truth. I was a woman. That girl continued making positive videos after that moment of honesty and eventually deleted the original video. But I had downloaded it, so I still have a copy. This is something I see a lot on social media. People aren't honest because they want to project a positive image. In today's culture, telling the truth is considered hate speech. So for them, love means telling everyone how wonderful everything is. As a result, Thousands of people follow these influencers and end up believing this narrative.
Well, over time, many of these influencers stopped posting. I've followed the pages of some big names in the transgender movement and watched as they went from posting constantly to simply disappearing. I find myself wondering, where are these people? What happened to them? There's a lot of regret they don't want to admit. About 3 years later, in 2012, I had a hysterectomy. It was a major decision. I remember feeling a hesitation at the time, realizing how permanent a hysterectomy would be. I even thought about freezing my eggs. Not that it would have been a great solution, and I wasn't a Christian back then, but today I feel so much regret. I wish I could go back to that moment and do everything differently. I don't know if, over time, the hormones had already left me infertile, but now I believe that God can heal. I find myself wondering, could I have had a child?
At the time, I was determined never to have another menstrual period because, even though they were rare during hormone therapy, they brought an unbearable sense of dysphoria. Feeling that was a painful reminder that I was a woman, something I would do anything to avoid. I didn't understand then that the pain wasn't coming from being a woman, but from an accumulation of sin in my life, both the sins I had committed and those committed against me. All of it had caused a rupture in my soul. Sexual sin, in particular, devastated me. People don't understand the impact of engaging in sexual sin outside of God's purpose. When we give our hearts outside the context of marriage, it starts to destroy us. I firmly believe that sex outside of marriage empties the love tank, rather than filling it and completing us as God intended within the covenant of marriage. I felt so empty. I thought I had no worth as a woman. I saw God's design for me through the lens of my pain and emotional brokenness. I realized my transition would never be something real, but even so, I couldn't imagine going back to being a woman. The emotional weight of facing that was so heavy that I preferred to keep living as a man, even though I knew that wasn't real either. Despite everything, God began to work in my heart. Over the years, He kept drawing me in and pursuing me. Interestingly, He used the radio to do this. I had been listening to conservative radio programs for years, influenced by my partner at the time, who was also trans. He was a biological man living as a woman, and we were both interested in politics and conservative talk radio. That partner was a key part of God's plan. While I had wanted a girlfriend to affirm my identity as a man, I was never physically attracted to women. I remember going out with a girl early on, but she was quite masculine and said, "It's okay, I'll let you be the man this time." At that moment, I thought, "You don't get it. I will never be the woman." And I ended it. However, this man pursued me intensely. He was very masculine in many ways, despite living a female identity. Looking back, I see how God used that relationship as a mirror for me. I saw in him truths I couldn't see in myself. He treated me the way a man treats a woman, and I clearly noticed the differences between us, like physical strength. Even with him taking estrogen and me taking testosterone, he was still much stronger than I was. He assumed many masculine roles, even as we tried to reverse our gender roles. This constantly reminded me of the truth. We couldn't erase who we truly were. I learned years later that he had lost his mother at 7 years old and, as the oldest of 4 siblings, had taken on a nearly maternal role from a very young age. He also had his own story of pain.
Oh.
Meanwhile, I kept listening to radio programs. Gradually, they started mentioning God. Over time, hearing about God began to soften my heart, even if just a little. Part of me wanted to believe the truth. Deep down, I knew it was true, but I didn't want to accept God because I wanted to live my own life. I knew what I was doing wasn't God's will, but I didn't believe God was good. Thankfully, my mom, Dad, and others were praying for me. Over the years, God kept drawing me closer, little by little. He used many tools in my life: dreams, people speaking the truth, and even a job where my boss was a Christian. One day, my mom asked me to create a website for her Bible study. Out of curiosity, I started reading the lessons without her knowing. My mom never imagined I would do that, especially since she had tried to fix me for years. When she finally surrendered me to the Lord and began to truly seek God, He started to change not just her life, but mine as well. God used many things to reach me. I want to encourage anyone praying for someone to never give up. God has infinite resources and unexpected ways to touch hearts. Even as I was reading those lessons just to summarize the content for the website, certain things began to catch my attention. God started speaking to me through those words, and I saw how He was transforming my mom. At that moment, I realized the gospel was true. I knew the Bible was real. I began to desire knowing the Lord. I would call my mom with questions, and she, having been so transformed over the years, shared with me what she knew. That's when I gave my heart to the Lord. It was a very sincere moment. I repented of everything I could remember and truly surrendered to God. But at that moment, I still thought I would be a man of God. I was completely sincere, but entirely mistaken. God, in His grace, met me where I was, but He didn't leave me there. He began to convict me and pull me away from that lifestyle. Many people ask, is it possible to be a Christian and live as transgender? The answer is that if you have the Holy Spirit, you cannot live comfortably in that lifestyle. I was under so much conviction. I knew it wasn't God's will, and He was calling me to trust Him and step away from it. Over the following years, God continued working on my heart. I knew He was asking me to leave that lifestyle, but it was so painful that I begged Him to take my life. I saw no way out. Yet, God kept drawing me closer. I reached the point where I knew I had to obey, even without hope. I thought I would never feel like a woman again, that I would never want to be a woman, and that I would never see myself as one. But over time, God performed a miracle in me. He began to heal me and transform my heart. As I let go of bitterness, forgave others, was forgiven, and reconciled with my mom, God started replacing the lies with truth. One of my favorite verses is Psalm 107, verse 20. He sent out His word and healed them. He rescued them from the grave. That's exactly what God did for me. He used His word to transform me. Little by little, I began to embrace being a woman. First, I became comfortable wearing women's clothes. Then, I started feeling at ease around other women. One day, during a women's discipleship group, I looked around and realized that the other women saw me as one of them. That was revolutionary for me. For the first time, I didn't feel like something different or inferior. I realized that I was one of them, not just physically, but completely. As God continued healing me, I began to love being a woman. I started asking Him to teach me about His design for men and women. Over the years, God has shown me so much about how He created us. There are more than 6,500 biological differences between men and women. We are created entirely distinct, but with the same purpose: to glorify God as men and women, reflecting different aspects of His nature. Ultimately, all of this points to the glory of Christ and God's reconciliation with humanity. God began teaching me so many things and preparing my heart for a husband. A little over 2 years ago, He brought an incredible man into my life. Interestingly, we met on the rainiest day of the year, which I recently realized was a symbol of blessing and renewal. It felt like, after all my past and everything I'd been through, everything had been made new. We got married a little over a year ago, on May 14th, and it has been an incredible journey. God is using this man to bring even more healing into my life, helping me understand the goodness of being a woman. The more I embrace my femininity and my God-given role as a woman, the more it awakens his masculinity. So often, we as women try to control and lead. But when we trust God and allow men to lead as they are called to, we're not being passive, we're trusting God's plan. This has been incredibly rewarding and gives them confidence to lead. This dynamic has been such a blessing for me. During this time, I had cut off almost everyone in my life who knew I was trans. I distanced myself from nearly everyone, including friends and some family members. The only people who knew were my partner and my parents. However, my parents never called me Jake or used male pronouns. At the time, it made me so angry. I would tell them they were hateful, that they didn't understand, and that they needed to get over it. I would say things like, "This is who I am. I'm never going to change. So either you call me Jake, or I don't know what I'll do." At times, I probably even threatened to cut them out of my life. Deep down, though, I knew they loved me. Despite the issues I had with my mom, I knew she loved me. She had proven it over the years, even when I was full of anger and resentment. Their love was like a thread that kept me connected to reality, even if I didn't want to admit it. They never intentionally tried to embarrass me. In public situations, like at restaurants, my mom would call me dear or love. However, sometimes she would accidentally call me Laura, and it would make me furious. At the same time, something inside me knew it was the truth. It was painful, but it also felt like it was pulling me back to reality. When I became a Christian, before realizing that it meant God was calling me to live authentically as a woman, I tried going to church. However, there was always an excuse. I didn't go back to church until after I had detransitioned. Even so, God was already working on my heart, and interacting with other Christians was a gradual and transformative process. I would often plan to go to church, but something always came up. I'd oversleep, forget, or come up with an excuse. There was a desire in me to be among Christians, but there was also a lot of fear. I was afraid of how people would treat me, wondering if I could hide my true story. Even though I knew the truth, that fear paralyzed me. I ended up attending a Bible study for a few weeks, while my partner traveled to New Mexico to stay with his brother for about 6 weeks. During that time, I was so hungry for Christian fellowship, but I was still afraid to go to a church. There was also bitterness toward the church because of past experiences in my youth, where I never felt like I belonged in youth groups. At the same time, there was a deep longing to belong to the body of Christ. I remember hearing a Bible study teacher say, "I can tell how much you love the Lord by how much you love his bride." That deeply challenged me. I thought, "Lord, I don't love your bride." I knew it was true and began praying, asking God to give me a love for the church. It wasn't until after I detransitioned that I returned to my parents' church, a church I had vowed I would never set foot in again. I had promised myself I would never go back to my hometown, never live with my parents again. But God led me to do all of those things. I ended up working at the church, and it became an essential part of my life. This process was an incredible work of healing, restoration, and redemption. So, there are recurring themes that are hard to ignore. One example that stood out to me was when I spoke with a young woman named Sophie. She began transitioning at 19, going through a process similar to mine. 2 points in particular come up frequently: a history of abuse leading to a search for male affirmation and an attempt to dissociate from one's own body. Sophie, for instance, shared that she had been a victim of abuse but avoided going into details. She said that after becoming a Christian, she realized that transitioning for her was a way to disconnect from her body. She blamed her femininity for what had happened. The idea that men have power also came up. Sophie wanted to escape objectification, situations like being stared at in the grocery store or harassed on the street. For her, Becoming a man seemed like a form of protection. This idea of self-protection is something I hear repeatedly in stories from trans women. There is a rejection of the inherent sexuality of the female body. They desperately try to distance themselves from it, believing that by becoming men, they will be protected. This pattern isn't exclusive to women. Many trans boys or those facing gender identity issues share similar stories. Older statistics already showed that a significant percentage of these individuals had experienced abuse, exposure to graphic content, or consumption of inappropriate materials, especially during childhood. Even those who say they weren't abused often report a history of early exposure to such content, which can cause deep insecurities, particularly when compared to the idealized bodies they see.
Bull.
Another common pattern among boys is their relationship with their fathers. Many have absent or emotionally distant fathers, or even when present, they are perceived as intimidating figures. A typical example is military fathers. While the father is away, the boy clings to his mother, who becomes a safe harbor. When the father returns, even if he is loving, his rigid and disciplinarian masculinity can be perceived as frightening. This dynamic becomes even more intense in families with older brothers who are abusive or overly aggressive. Many boys share that masculinity became something scary, leading them to distance themselves from it and gravitate toward the maternal figure. This distance is often the starting point of a disconnection from their male identity. The story of transitioning, in many cases, is about cutting away who the person truly is, whether due to trauma, rejection, or a distorted view of their identity. However, God can bring healing and redemption, as so many stories demonstrate. I began reflecting and talking to the Lord about this issue of gender. If there are more than 6,500 biological differences between men and women, and our sex chromosomes are present in every cell of our bodies, it means that every part of us is uniquely designed. It's so profoundly significant that the first statement made about a baby is, "It's a boy," or "It's a girl." There's something very deep about being male or female, far beyond what we understand. Today's culture, in some ways, has placed exaggerated importance on this, claiming it's something each person can define however they want. Yet, to God, it is significant in a completely different way. As the church, we often fail to acknowledge these differences in a healthy way. It doesn't mean that one gender is superior to the other, but that both glorify God in distinct ways. Both have equal value. In Jesus' time, women were undervalued and had very restricted social roles. They were often used, abused, and had few options beyond caring for the home. Yet, Jesus challenged these cultural norms. He met the Samaritan woman at the well, defended the woman caught in adultery, and appeared first to Mary Magdalene after the resurrection. This shows how much God values women. Many times women view the biblical role of women as a curse. I used to think that being a woman was a burden, that God didn't love me as much as he loved men. But that's not true. God deeply values women. In the Bible, he compares his followers to his bride, showing a profound and special love for them. The church needs to recognize the importance of helping children and young people reconnect with their true identity. These kids desperately need same-sex role models, especially when there's a disconnect with their parents. In my case, I needed help connecting with my mom, to see that I was like her, that she loved me, and that behind her pain was a genuine struggle to live out her faith. My mom went through so much suffering. She sought out pastors crying, saying she was trying so hard to live the Christian life. She was stressed, exhausted, and completely overwhelmed, to the point of developing heart problems due to the stress. Instead of receiving support, she often heard, "Francine, you just need to try harder." Today, I have a deep respect for what my mom endured. Unfortunately, in the church, we often try to project a perfect image and fail to recognize how much people are suffering. We need to create a space of acceptance and truth. One of the most striking similarities in stories like mine and those of other detransitioners is the moment after a double mastectomy. Sophie, for example, shared a similar experience, looking in the mirror and realizing, "I'm still not a man." She would see her own hips, her curves, and feel that she could never achieve what she was seeking. Like me, she wondered, will this ever be real? Even so, we hear activists argue that these surgeries and procedures are essential, even for minors, under the justification that they prevent suicides. It's a type of emotional pressure placed on parents and even on society as a whole. They claim that the depression or unhappiness of these individuals has nothing to do with confusion or past traumas, but is solely due to a lack of acceptance from people like us. This narrative ignores the reality of so many stories of pain and regret from people who underwent these interventions seeking relief, but didn't find the peace they were hoping for. Many claim that the blame for the unhappiness, or even suicidal thoughts of trans people, lies with Christians, conservatives, or laws that don't allow these changes to be made as quickly as they want. The narrative is that if they were fully affirmed and had unrestricted access to procedures, they would be happy and feel complete. However, this is a massive lie. Many people, especially parents, feel emotionally extorted by this type of rhetoric. If you don't affirm, if you don't celebrate, you'll be responsible for someone's suicide. This is a form of emotional blackmail that many find impossible to resist. I'm part of a Reddit forum with over 45,000 members, including detransitioners and people questioning their transition. Every day, I see new posts from detransitioners saying things like, "Why didn't anyone tell me the truth? Why did doctors let me do this?" I remember a 14-year-old who said, "Who lets a 14-year-old make this decision?" He had already undergone a double mastectomy and felt deep regret. Some of these people remain suicidal. I read the story of a young woman who, after having a mastectomy, went back to her doctor 6 months later and asked if the procedure could be reversed. She didn't know that breasts couldn't simply be put back. Even with implants like the ones I now have, it's not the same. There are no mammary glands, no original nerves, no sensitivity. It's irreversible and devastating.
Studies show that surgery doesn't solve the problem. A study in Sweden, a country highly affirming of trans individuals, revealed that suicide rates remain the same before and after surgery. In fact, these rates are significantly higher than in the general population. This shows that medical interventions don't resolve dysphoria or the underlying issues. Additionally, we see many detransitioners speaking out boldly against these practices, even if they haven't fully detransitioned. People like Scott Nugent and Renee Jacks have been raising awareness about the dangers and consequences of these interventions. Renee Jacks, for instance, wrote a book titled "Don't Get on the Plane," describing the regret of undergoing sex reassignment surgeries.
If you have someone close to you who is living as the opposite sex, it's common to hear that you need to affirm, use their chosen pronouns, and celebrate their choice, or else you'll be seen as unloving. Especially as Christians, we are pressured to accept a distorted version of love, which is confused with tolerating sin. But how can you approach this person with truth and love? First, pray a lot. Ask God for guidance and listen to what He has to say. Then, start with questions. These individuals are carrying a lot of pain and are desperate to be heard. Ask about their lives. Try to understand what they're feeling. If they don't open up right away, consider being vulnerable first. Sharing something personal can create a safe space and encourage them to open up as well. Even if you haven't faced the same struggle, you can say, "I've felt like that about something else before." Show empathy without necessarily agreeing. Many parents I know have taken this approach and have seen significant results because, above all, these individuals need to know they are loved and that there is truth and hope beyond this path. I've seen many comments on YouTube, especially on detransitioner videos, where people say things like, "I felt like that when I was a kid," I'm so glad I didn't grow up in this generation because I probably would have been pushed down the transgender path, but I ended up overcoming it naturally. I've heard several stories like that. If you have a similar story or want to share what God has done in your life, even if it's not about gender issues, that can help a lot. Talking about times when you didn't like yourself, felt like you didn't fit in, or were hurt by others is something everyone can relate to. Share how you were helped, how you overcame, and ask about the story of the person you're talking to as well. For me, all of this comes back to the gospel. God has done an incredible work of healing in my life, and I know what these people truly need is Jesus. They might not respond right away, but our obedience isn't measured by other people's responses. God measures our obedience by our willingness to obey. I like to remind people and myself that we can't outlove God. Many Christians try to soften what the Bible says about marriage, sexuality, and gender to seem more loving. But if God is love, we can't outdo him in love. Thinking we can be more loving by disagreeing with God is, in reality, saying we are more loving than he is, and that's simply not true. The good news is that if God is love, and he created us male and female, then the most loving thing we can do is affirm that truth, consistently and gently. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share my testimony. I'm grateful for this chance and for everything God has done. Thank you again, and may God bless you. When hearing this testimony, I ask you, what is God speaking to your heart? What areas of your life are still bound by the lies you believe? Could it be time for you to face the truth and allow God to begin working in your life? No matter how far you've gone, there is always a way back. God is ready to restore, heal, and transform your story. But are you willing to trust him? Think about this. What are you desperately seeking from others or the world that only God can provide? If this testimony touched you in any way, I invite you to take action. Reflect on what God is speaking to you today and share in the comments what impacted you the most. Your story could inspire others. If you'd like to keep learning more about God's love and truth, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any content that can transform your life. God has a plan for you. Trust him, take the next step, and let him guide your path. May God bless you.
I started my life in a sect that initially preached the gospel and was Christ-centered, but over time it became corrupt and manipulative. The leadership was oppressive, isolating us from the rest of the world and believing they were the only true Christians. My first exposure to the occult probably came from Hollywood horror films, and certainly music played a huge role. I listened to a lot of metal and rock and roll. I'm not saying these genres are satanic or inherently evil by nature, but the artists I listened to were evil and open about it. From a young age, I sinned in ways so advanced and dark that I knew I was condemned before God. I saw no way out and felt that if anyone really knew what I had done in private, no one would love me. In fact, not only would they not love me, but they would be disgusted. Then I felt all this shame and condemnation, but it was like a holy crushing. In that moment, I felt the approach of a different being, a holy being, who silenced all the noise in my mind, all the other voices, all this shame, everything dispersed. God, you are the Lord. I recognize that you are the God of the universe. Only you can forgive my sins. I will follow you, but you have to change me. You have to make me new. Only you can save me from this hole I've dug, and you have to do all the work. I will cooperate, I'll do what I can, but we both know this isn't something I can do alone. God accepted that. All he wanted was my submission and surrender. And for the first time in my life, I loved Jesus.
If you felt moved by this testimony and want to watch this story and more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Here, We share powerful experiences that can transform lives and strengthen faith. Click the subscribe button, activate the notification bell to receive updates, and join our community of faith and hope.